Good morning, good afternoon, and a very good evening to you wherever you may be. My name is Wajahat S. I'm an independent journalist based here in New York City, reporting on Pakistan, India, and the rest of South Asia. It's been 2 weeks since the ceasefire brokered by the Americans was put in place and is still in place between India and Pakistan. But today's show does not reflect upon who won Operation Sindoor versus who did well in Operation Bunyano Mursus, which was the Pakistani riposte rather, to what the Indians did by attacking Pakistan on the 7th of May. Rather, today we have a 2 week appraisal about what the two militaries are getting up to and what they are planning for the long run. What have they done in the immediate wake and aftermath of the operations and where they are going next. We will look back and we will look forward and we will answer these questions about military reorganization or restructuring with one of the best military watchers in the business. Kamran Bokhari is a friend and colleague. He's the senior director of the Newlines Institute in Washington, D.C. And he has a knack for really predicting and being on top of his game about what's happening. A couple of years ago, Kamran, welcome to the show. A couple of years ago, you wrote a piece which is featured in the link in the description as well. You wrote a piece basically laying out the Indian mechanism for reform, for restructuring. This is a huge military, the world's second largest. And you told us about how the Indians are well on their way to restructuring the military, not necessarily just focusing on the Pakistanis, but on the Chinese, on their maritime ambitions as well, different commands, like a missile command, a cyber command, etc. I'd like to very much know from you today what and where that restructuring stands, because it seems like that just today, the Indians have met, the Indian service chiefs and the chief of defense staff have met the country's president and are well on their way to getting that reorganization done. Meanwhile, the Pakistanis are doing what the Pakistanis do, a little bit of self-aggrandizement in the last couple of weeks, lots of chest thumping, maybe for good reasons by the Pakistani military, but then a fifth star for Field Marshal Asim Munir and not much else. Tell us, Kamran, in these 2 weeks since the conflict has wrapped up, how have the Indians moved forward in A, licking their wounds and B, getting reorganized? And how have the Pakistanis moved forward and gotten ready for the next wave, which I'm assuming is going to come because that's what the Prime Minister of India says. Expect more.
Thanks, Wajahat. Okay, so let's put things in context here. It's been 2 weeks since the cessation of hostilities. Both sides are looking at what happened, what they did well, what went wrong, where are the problems, and how to deal with this. This is a new reality for both. Until May 7th, India had not used this level of airstrikes against Pakistan in retaliation for terror attacks that originate from Pakistan. So this is a new thing for the Indians. There's constant learning going on within any military establishment, even in times of peace. In times of war, there's an acceleration in those efforts. You learn new things. There's nothing like learning on the job or learning through actual kinetic conditions, as opposed to wargaming. Those are two separate. Wargaming is necessary, but at the same time, it's not a substitute for what you learn from actual battle space conditions. So I think that's what both sides are doing. That's not going to be telegraphed. We will not hear about those things. They will be quietly done at various levels. The Pakistani Air Force played a significant role in these 100 hours of conflict between May 7th and May 10th. So they have a lot of work on their plate. The military command, which we now have, the Army chief is now the Field Marshal. He's no longer a 4-star, as has been the case traditionally. So I think that is sort of taking away the focus on that, takes away from what happens behind the scenes. So there's a lot that the Army Command, the Joint Staff Headquarters, which brings together all the three services, they have to sort of look at it. And of course, with the Strategic Plans Division as well involved. So there's a lot that they need to chew on. They need to sort of look at, there's obviously some, satisfaction, contentment in the way that they held up. So there is that aspect. And so you sort of give yourself good points and say, hey, we did well. But at the same time, you're not going to telegraph this. You're going to basically say, guys, obviously we're not telling the world what we did wrong, but we know what we did wrong. So how do we improve on that? Flip over to the Indian side. The Indian side has to do the same thing. The Indian side has to do this because they lost some jets, in this process. So that's something that's an angle that they have to tighten up, to say the very least. So there is this post-battle assessment, evaluation, and then how do you improve? How do you absorb what you learned and modify your existing protocols and structures and processes so that they become part of your standard operating procedures? So there's that happening. Above that level, there is something that is pre-existing. The pre-existing situation is Pakistan with all of its problems, civil, military, political, security. There's still the Western flank. The TTP is still out there, will be out there for a long time to come. There's the Baloch insurgency. So that's sort of the context in which all of this has to be dealt with. In India's case, it's a different context. It's a context in which India sort of was on a trajectory to play major league geopolitics, to not be sort of absorbed so extensively on its western flank, but raising altitude and looking at the broader region, the conflict with China, the alignment with the United States. And for that, it has been engaged in a massive military reorganization dating back to at least 2023, if not earlier. These things take time. We're talking about the reorg of the entire military apparatus, the entire structure of the Indian military, dating back to independence, changing things that have been in place for almost 80 years. So that is sort of an ongoing long-term project. And then that predates what happened with Pakistan. Now, there are lessons to be learned from what happened with Pakistan. There's Chinese assistance to Pakistan in the form of hardware, in the form of technical cooperation, in the form of providing IMINT and satellite support. So how do you absorb all of that and say, okay, we need to continue doing our reorg, but these new realities have to be factored in to whatever we're doing?
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack. So let's break this down. We're going to brush past what the Pakistanis have telegraphed versus not telegraphed. Obviously, what they've not telegraphed, there's a lot going on right now, probably in the wargaming rooms of Staff College and NDU. There's probably a lot going on in the Air Superiority College of the PAF, the Air War College, etc. They're probably giving themselves a pat on the back. In fact, they're probably studying how well they did. All that battle damage assessment will never be telegraphed. I'm sure that the Air Defense Command is also getting an airful from the rest of the gang about where their systems failed. And they did, at many levels, fail, from Rawalpindi to Bhulari. So let's just be honest, while the Air Force did well, some arms and services did not. So I'm sure the Pakistanis are doing their thing. But what they have telegraphed, Kamran, is pretty obvious. It's been debated. This is not one of those shows, but just for everyone's knowledge, General Asim Munir, the Chief of Army Staff, is not General Asim Munir anymore. He's Field Marshal Asim Munir. His political proxies are saying he's going to be Field Marshal indefinitely. Not my words, but the words of his spokespersons on TV talk shows. And then, interestingly, it's also being suggested that he's now going to head all three services, which confuses me at least, because the whole chairman joint chief structure is put into this weird, ambiguous, abstract space. But that's what the Pakistanis have telegraphed. The Indians have telegraphed something completely different, and I want to concentrate on that because we don't really study the Indian side much. Today, they met the president, the CDS, the army chief, the air chief, the navy chief. They're well on their way to organizing along the lines of what you predicted a couple of years ago. They're well on their way to organizing along those lines, integrating the 17 commands, including logistics, training, the missile forces. Operations will go to theater commands. The service chiefs are going to be raising, training, and sustaining. It's going to be a differential between force application and force generation for Pakistani purveyors and students of the army. That's sort of like the Indians are really embellishing the command versus staff divide. There's going to be a command posts, which is going to be in charge of the different theaters, and there's going to be the staffing post, which is basically going to administratively and logistically run the military. Now, premised on that, plus a separate maritime command. Now, premised on all of that, how would you think that the Pakistanis at this point should be watching the Indians, and how should the Indians now be responding to the Pakistanis, who a couple of years ago were not much of a problem, but clearly are, because now they're partnered up. Actually, they're the real life lab test experiment of all that Chinese hardware, which got all the attention in this theater this time around, those PL-15s and those J-10s and perhaps even those J-35s, which are going to be coming up soon. So break it down for us, that how should both sides now be watching each other? What are both sides doing on the ground?
So let's apply empathetic analysis to both sides. So if you're Pakistan, you obviously don't have to actually mimic, it's impossible, exactly what the Indians are doing. They're a completely different league. They're a completely different size, and their realities and the threat perceptions are very different than Pakistan's. For Pakistan, it doesn't have to worry about China. In fact, it's an ally of China, and a very close one. The Indians have to worry about a two-front situation. Now, when I wrote that piece that you're referencing about the military reorg in India from 2023, at the time, the understanding was that, you know what, Pakistan and India aren't going to get along, but we're not going to see massive escalation. And the reason for that was that after Balakot in 2019 and the ceasefire 2 years later in 2021, things were looking okay. Yes, the Indians sliced and diced Kashmir and they turned it into new union territories. That really irritated the Pakistanis. The relationship, got worse. But there was a normal. A normal was, okay, we're going to keep all of this under wraps. We're not really going to go at each other. For Pakistan at the time,
ceasefire. There was a 4-year ceasefire in place. Things were okay.
Yeah, things were okay. And because partly because the Pakistanis knew that at the time that, look, when they put the ceasefire, it was like March of 2021. Mm-hmm. It was only a few months before the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan and the re-Talibanization of that country, and Emmerich 2.0 coming into power, which has had profound and adverse consequences for Pakistan's security in the form of TTP, a far more energized TTP.
Right.
We've also seen the rise of Baloch nationalist insurgents. So for Pakistan, the western flank was the issue. That, okay, you know what? We've got things, there's a mechanism by which we are, getting along with India. We're not sparring, but this is where we're going to focus. So at that point in time, the Indians, you take that into consideration. That's when I wrote it, and I said, you know what? Okay, let's assume nothing goes wrong on the India-Pakistan border. Then now India is looking at building itself for much bigger military purposes, which is dealing with China. We also had Galwan in June of 2020.
Sure.
That had set into motion a new reality between India and China. And then, of course, the U.S. angle, where the U.S. wants to align with India in order to counter China. So the Indians were preparing. That whole military reorg, with all its details, was geared towards India becoming much bigger than it has been. In other words, India looked at Pakistan and said, okay, we've gotten to a point where we don't need to spar, and our horizons have broadened. Our circumstances are broadened. We're the fifth largest economy at the time. This year, they're going to take over a number, I don't know when, but at some point during this year, according to the IMF, India is going to replace Japan for the number 4 position, if I have that accurate.
According to some numbers, that may have already happened anyways. But moving on, India had bigger plans.
India had bigger plans, and India continues to have those bigger plans. Now the question is, let's factor in April 22nd, Pahalgam, and May 7th through 10th, that short war, into this entire long-term planning. How did that change and alter India's plans? Well, it does, because now you have a new dynamic that you were not thinking about when you started the military reorg on your western flank. So how do you, the big question is, how do you, and to what extent can you focus with an aggressive posture on your western flank and deal with China, the two-front thing that we keep hearing about, the LAC and the LOC, et cetera, although this time the LOC has become sort of like, it's crossed that threshold. We're now on the international boundary.
Sure.
So this is a much bigger undertaking. So whatever the Indians do, they will have to sort of course correct. And I'm sure they've already done that, and they're in the process of doing that to say, okay, this reorg is no longer China specific. It also includes how do we deal with Pakistan. And then the bigger thing, which is what the US is interested in, is will you be able to project force and power into the Indian Ocean basin? And which is where sort of these theater commands and this division of labor between the service chiefs who are going to staff, train, and sustain the force structure, while theater commands will be the ones doing force application. That's going to be very interesting. How do they do that? How does this division of labor happen? And mind you, let's just go back to 2019. So in 2019 is when the Indians appointed a chief of defense staff. This had been something that had been talked about going all the way back to Kargil in 1999, but now they did it. And so this is also just like 6 years old, this position. The key, and as you know, General Anil Chauhan, the current chief of defense staff, has written a book that was being discussed in the Indian media as well, which is why we had that report today, is saying, look, it's been 22 months since I took over. And 22 months is not enough.
That's interesting. A serving CDS has written a book. That's interesting. And it's just come out, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I read in the Hindu, unless I misread it. So,
What must get inside that book? All right. But anyways, go on.
So what we have is a CDS who's been in office for almost 2 years. And this is his job. This is his main job, to reorganize all the existing command structures into something that's far more effective and is prepared for what the Indians look at as the 21st century, and a 21st century in which Pakistan is going to be dealt with, not through diplomacy and terrorism. I mean, if we go by what this current government is doing, what they're basically saying is, look, the Americans may have moved on and said, okay, there's no need for war on terror. They have, gone from fighting the Taliban to saying to the Taliban, hey, Afghanistan is yours. This is not our war. We've defeated Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and therefore, we don't have to be militarily involved. And this is part of the overall U.S. Change as well in terms of its global strategy. We don't do the heavy lifting. You allow for regional actors, create a balance of power in different regions where regional actors are taking the lead while the U.S. is in the background. So they may have left that, but for us, at least this government, the government of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, it's basically saying, look, we're not going to tolerate terrorism from Pakistan anymore. In fact, we're going to use military force to prevent this from happening. So that's a big undertaking. So you have to do that. You have to deal with a China that's also watching all of this. I mean, we just had a report on NDTV just like about a few weeks ago, I'm going to say about a month, in which they reported in extensive detail the construction of 6 bases along the 2,200-mile border between India and China. That's something that they have to absorb. And at the same time, how do you continue while you're dealing with your neighborhood, while you're still South Asia focused, but then how do you play that bigger Indo-Pacific game that is more interesting to the Americans, and how do you prove your worth? I think that's going to be the challenge.
Right, right. So, okay, so we're going to wrap this up before it gets too wonky. I'm going to ask you some really quick rapid fire questions to really put things in perspective, because I like this. I like where this is going, but let's keep it really succinct. I literally need one line for the following questions. I'm going to rattle them off. Okay. So the Pakistanis are obviously, as usual, worried about India, especially with this new normal of Modi. But what is Mr. Modi worried about with this new arrangement, this parity, this partnership of the Pakistanis and the Chinese, especially in a two-front scenario?
That is the big question on the mind of the Indian Prime Minister and the leadership. That look, we thought that we could use military force to reestablish deterrence and prevent Pakistan from, at the very least, turning a blind eye to terrorism, and in a worst case scenario, actually being involved. So that hasn't panned out as the Indians hoped. So not only has it cost, there was a cost associated with it, and let's just talk about the jets they lost, but there's a lot bigger cost that we don't have time to get into. But if you just look at that cost, it sort of says this didn't really work out as we planned it to. And why? Because the other adversary, the bigger adversary, is actually tag teaming with the smaller adversary. So how do we now incorporate that, and how do we deal with that? That's, I think, one of the issues that is has to be for right there at the top of the priority list.
Right. So besides the jets that it lost, but doesn't really come out transparently about them, even to date. Apart from the jets, is it fair to assess that the Indians have also incurred a lot of reputational damage, especially in Washington and its other Western allies and friends, who were expecting the 1.4 million man mighty Bharat Fauj to be the muscular, democratic South Asian answer to the PLA. That hasn't panned out, and it seems like they're still they were leveraging themselves, marketing themselves, placing themselves for the big boys league. But they're still playing small potatoes with a medium power, with a middle power like Pakistan. In Urdu, there's a lovely word. What is it? Kache khanche. The when you play marbles with the
Kanche.
Right. So is it fair to assess that the Indians have really downgraded themselves in the Western assessment of not being ready for the big leagues?
I think so. I think that there has been sort of a rude awakening in Washington. We can also see sort of the frustration within this administration, within the Trump White House. This is not what Trump became president and walked into. What he wanted was, look, I'm coming in. I have to deal with China. I need India on my side. The last thing I want is India sparring with Pakistan. And I'm trying to end wars. Trump is saying, I'm trying to end wars. Look at the efforts look at the lengths to which we're going in Ukraine. And, obviously it's a struggle there. Look at the lengths at which we're going in the Middle East, and it's a struggle there. Do we want another war? No. And which is why the president is coming out constantly repeating himself and saying, hey, look, we stopped a war, which could have been horrendous from, happening. And he's trying to take credit for that, obviously. I mean, it's good politics. But at a strategic level, that's not what the Americans want. The Americans want the Indians to sort of say, you don't need to, look, we fought terrorism through war. Look where we are.
Yep.
We had Afghanistan, we had Iraq. We don't need to go into the details. Everybody knows about it. Do you really want to do that? I mean, hey, this is something I think that even the Americans are saying to the Israelis as well when it comes to Gaza. There was an article in Foreign Affairs written by former CIA chief and military commander General David Petraeus and his colleagues that basically are saying, look, learn from the lessons that we, learn lessons from the mistakes we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was addressing the Israelis. I think in this context, the Americans are saying, this can be dealt with without the use of war. If you're going to do war here, we can't have you playing in that league. We can't rely on you. Your attention span is diverted. Second of all, if you just think about it, look, we don't want you just to be a military power. We want to reduce our exposure to Chinese manufacturing. We want some of that manufacturing. We know it's a work in progress. It's going to take a while, but we want to get going on it. And if we're going to turn you into an alternative destination for investments that then translate into manufacturing output from India so we can reduce exposure to China, well, that's not happening if there's a war going on.
Yep.
What investor is going to come in and say, you know what, I'm going to park my money in India while you have an active battle space on your western flank? And it's much more complicated. The Chinese are involved. They're involved on the northern border with you, but they're also involved on the western flank. This is not good for business.
Yeah,
That's the American
it's
view.
not a mere skirmish. It's not a mere skirmish. But let's go back to the basics here. The two militaries, India versus Pakistan, 1.45 million Indian active personnel versus Pakistan, 650,000. India's defense budget touching almost 80 billion a year USD versus Pakistan's, which hasn't even reached 10 billion. India's 14 corps, 6 operational commands, 40 divisions versus Pakistan's 11 corps and the good old GHQ with 25 plus divisions. India's blue water navy versus Pakistan's green water navy. India's 2,000 aircraft versus Pakistan's 900, though they pack quite a punch. The only parity they have is in warheads. India's 170 nuclear warheads versus Pakistan's 170 nuclear warheads. There's no parity except on the nuclear level. And so the lesson learned for Pakistan today is what? Just maintain a punch in the air and maintain nuclear parity, and versus the Indians, who will now consistently, if they keep on going the way they're going, if they continue to be ruled by the BJP, which seems to be the case, the new normal, which is a very Israeli-like formula, which is that they're going to react at a time and place of their own choosing disproportionately at any given time for any given terror attack. While you've touched upon the Israelis and how that model hasn't worked, we should also remind our viewers that India is not Israel and Pakistan is not Lebanon or Syria. The stakes are different here. What should Pakistani and Indian strategic planners really be thinking at this point to decrease the stakes of nuclear war, which we got close to this time, at least according to the American president?
So look, they're going to have to think outside the box, because the sort of conventional wisdom isn't working on either side. The conventional wisdom of, the pre-Modi governments didn't work in stopping terrorism.
Yeah.
It bought them some respite. There were years in between. So if we say, okay, 2002 standoff ends, then we have like 6 years until Mumbai, and then there's another, the clock starts again, and you start from 2008, and then you reach 2014. Well, there are problems in between, but they're managed. I think in 2014, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he started a new approach. The new approach is get tough, okay? Just don't threaten that, military action, actually show teeth and put your mouth where your money is. The problem with that isn't working either, and it's actually making things worse, and it is exacting a cost on India. And the cost is, if you're going to continue to play with, in this arena, this small battle box, India-Pakistan, well, first of all, it isn't just India-Pakistan. The Chinese are always going to be there, okay, in the room. Second of all, it sort of sends a message to the world that is, or at least people question and say, is India ready for the big leagues?
Mhm.
Is India ready to move beyond being just a South Asian player and being a global player? Or are we all getting ahead of ourselves? I mean, that's the big question. So India has to decide on that. It has to find a way to deal with Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan has to get over as well. I mean, General Bajwa said, we want to get over history. The question is, how do you get over history? And so I think the issue of Kashmir has to be rethought. There was some rethinking. We saw quite a bit of creative thinking under the Musharraf regime.
Mhm.
And there were some formulas put together that didn't work out. But I think that that is what the Pakistani side has to do. There is something that Pakistan also has to think about, is that, let's say you achieve a situation where you say, okay, we're not going to fight with India, okay? But the Indian-Chinese competition, the US-Chinese competition. So Pakistan has to think about that, because right now, China assisted Pakistan in its moment of need, and there's close partnership, the humanware and the hardware that I talk about. What happens if there is a competition that gets hot, very hot, between China and India? How does Pakistan stay away from that? Because that's not a problem that Pakistan should get itself involved. Where India,
It's going to be very tempting to get into that for the Pakistanis.
yeah, but this thing is that just as I said, there's a cost for India to get entangled with Pakistan. There's a cost for Pakistan to get entangled in the India-China competition. And of course, Pakistan is already finding itself, and this will increase, especially in the wake of the 100 hours battle that we saw, of being kind of caught between the Chinese and the Americans. We don't know how the Americans are going to react to what the Chinese are doing. I mean, you talked about the J-35. That's a fifth generation aircraft. I don't know when the Pakistanis will receive it. It's not going to go down well in Washington that, the Chinese are inducting fifth generation aircraft into the PLA Air Force, and at the same time giving it to the Pakistani Air Force. I'm not saying it's happening, but if it does happen, these are the kind of things that Pakistan should think about. And I think Pakistan and India both have bigger issues to deal with than fighting with each other.
Sure. But on that last note, you'd mentioned that the Pakistanis need to rethink Kashmir, that they need to rethink Kashmir too. And you mentioned Musharraf. But is Asim Munir a Musharraf? Is Asim Munir a Bajwa? If one were to do a personality profile, a psychological profile of the man, his Islamist leanings, his being a master of the Quranic verses, aka Hafiz-e-Quran, his speeches, his nomenclature. Just today, evidently, all Baloch insurgents are not Baloch insurgents, but they are Fitna al-Hindustan, a very Arabist, Islamist way of framing the proxy war that allegedly India is behind in Balochistan. Do you see Field Marshal Asim Munir be that guy who rethinks Kashmir?
Look, as tempting as it is to get involved in that kind of conversation, as a strategic analyst, I tend to take a dim view of personalities.
That's interesting.
They are, personalities are here. I mean, look, there was a time when Musharraf was writ large, synonymous with Pakistan.
Sure, but Musharraf was a Scotch drinking, self-propelled artillery special forces liberal.
Sure.
This guy is not, or maybe he is.
But we also had Zia, okay?
Yeah.
So
okay.
There was Zia, and Zia's not around anymore.
Right.
Look, chiefs, leaders, presidents, heads of states, they come and they go, okay? The issue over here is institutionalization. I think that Pakistan, to answer your question, I think that the man who was behind Kargil then went and made peace with India.
Sure.
So I don't rule out the possibility that this current chief, who looks in a certain way,
Sure,
I'm not going to rule out the possibility that he can sort of under the right circumstances, do something completely different and surprise all of us. But that's not the point. The point over here is, as an institution, the Pakistani military and the Pakistani state and the Pakistani nation has to move on and say, okay, where are we going to be in 5-10 years from now? What are we going to be doing? Because the world is changing, and the world is, we're in a very, very historic moment, globally speaking. The entire world is unanchored. Okay, the old ways of doing things are no longer the same. The United States is adjusting to that. We have a very, very radical way of doing things in Washington, and so this is a moment of opportunity. I mean, people like to look at it and say, "Oh, this is a very perilous environment. There are threats here." Well, where there are threats, there are opportunities. So I think that the Pakistani military has to look at it and say, the Zia era is like several decades in the rear view mirror, but how can we sort of ideologically move on from it? Because that's harder to do. And so a lot of that has to sort of fall by the wayside, because ideology is not policy. Ideology is something that may offer or may not offer a is a tool to rally the nation, but in the long term, it is corrosive, deeply corrosive. And so I think that that's, if I'm going to answer your question, I'm going to say, look, that's where we should be thinking. Field Marshal Asim Munir is in the here and now. Time flies, it wasn't too long ago we were talking about Imran Khan. Where is Imran Khan today? He's marginalized.
Yep.
I'm not saying that's a permanent condition.
Yep.
These realities are dynamic. Let's move beyond personalities. Let's focus on the institutions. And both countries have a lot of work to do. Yep. They have a lot of people who are expecting their governments to deliver. And it would be a great idea not to disappoint those people.
I'll run with that. Kamran Bokhari, thank you. And on your point about ideology is not policy, absolutely. In fact, ideology is a subset, or should be a subset, of policy, and not the other way around. That's how great countries are run. Kamran Bokhari, thank you for your time, man. I appreciate this. We should do this more often. Keep up with the good work. We'll cite your reports. Kamran Bokhari is the Senior Director of the Newlines Institute in Washington, D.C., and he will be back with us soon. I'm Wajahat S. Share, like, subscribe, comment, and catch us for more on all things South Asia. And would appreciate it if you give me a follow or a like on the channel and the links that are given. Take care. Pakistan, Zindabad.